On this video, I'm going to talk all about the pivot. What is the pivot? How do you do it? When would you use the pivot? We're going to talk about pivoting to your left and pivoting to your right. My name's Tony Jeffries, Olympic medalist boxer, former undefeated professional and 7 times national champion. Welcome to my YouTube channel. So the pivot, if you don't know what it is, I'm sure you've heard of that phrase. What is it? Well, the pivot is a defensive footwork move where you're changing the angle and defending at the same time. It can also be used as an offense as well. You can defend and counter with the pivot. And I'm going to go over all of that with you right now. This is what the pivot would look like. You're in your boxing stance, and I'll pivot it off. I've changed the angle. I'll show you again. When you're pivoting to your left, you're kind of bringing your back foot around to your left side like this. And if you're an orthodox boxer, which means you're right-handed, that right there is the simplest way to do the pivot. So I'm here in my boxing stance. My front foot doesn't lift up off the ground. And I always remember my coach used to tell me, imagine that you've got a nail through your foot right there and your foot can't move backwards or forwards or lift. All it can do is turn around. So that's what you can visualize. The foot got a nail through it into the floor, and when you've got that visualization there, it makes it a lot easier to pivot. Other analogies people like to use is if you're squishing a bug, you're turning your foot like that, or if you're putting a cigarette out and you're twisting and pressing into the floor. It's the same sort of thing. I'm going to show you from this angle. So I'm in my boxing stance. I'm going to squish that bug and then pivot, and I've changed the angle. Now I'm facing this way. So with this pivot, it is kind of like a 90-degree change of angle that you're doing. I'm facing forward, I'm facing this way. I've come around, now I'm facing this way. Now you might be thinking, when shall I use this in a fight? And one thing I like to visualize is if you've got a shorter opponent who's coming at you, kind of like a Mike Tyson style opponent, he's coming at you, it's great to pivot and let him go that way. Changing the angle, if he's flying forward, pivot, go that way. And one thing that you need to do when you are doing this is keeping that lead hand up, because if he's coming forward, throwing a big right hand, and this hand's down, you're going to get clipped right there, and you don't want to get clipped, especially if you're fighting someone like Mike Tyson. Another thing, or your stance, where you should land. A couple of mistakes is, well, that was the first big mistake. People will have that hand down in the pivot. The other thing is where your feet land. When you are doing that pivot, your feet should land back in the perfect boxing stance. So I'm in the perfect boxing stance here, I've pivoted, I'm in the perfect boxing stance here. People will go too much and they'll come all the way around and the feet will be off balance, or they'll not go far enough and now you're open and you're square and you're off balance again. Now, let's talk about countering as well, or throwing that punch as you're pivoting. I love doing this as a fighter. So we've got that smaller, shorter guy coming, little Mike Tyson. And now, as that foot moves, the left hook is going to come. Boom. So as he's coming, I'm doing that pivot, boom, and I'm throwing that punch. Now with this, it's important that the punch and the foot lands at the same time. So I'm going to make a sound, boom, when they both land. Boom. There, they land at the same time. Boom. They land at the same time. The reason why it's so important that they land at the same time is you're going to keep your balance. If you try and do it, it's going to be hard for me to do it, where that lands, then that lands, it kind of puts you off balance. It kind of slows down the rhythm. And as well, if you've done that, then it's harder to get the power behind the punch, and harder to come back with more punches. So try and make sure they land at the same time. There. Now that's the pivot hook. You're pivoting to your left if you're orthodox like me, right-handed. Now let's talk about pivoting to the right. I get asked, can you do this? When would you do this? This is a harder pivot to do, but it can definitely be done. It's the same sort of thing. If you've got that nail through your foot, that's squishing that bug, and you're going to pivot to the other way, right? You might be thinking, well, when would you ever do this? Because if someone's coming on, you kind of off balance it and you square, which you are, which it's not great to do that all the time. But where it is great to use this is if I'm fighting someone and I'm working inside, bam, I'm working inside. I've pivoted, I've changed that angle. So if he's on the ropes there, and I'm going and he's covering up, and I want to change that angle, you can pivot to your right there. Another thing I like to do with this, rather than the pivot, I kind of prefer the step, which is very similar, but your front foot leaves the floor. On the pivot, it doesn't leave the floor. On the step, it does leave the floor. Reason why I like this is because it helps with balance. So let's just see, I've through the 1, 2, I've stepped, that foot comes off the floor a tiny little bit for a split second, and I just feel more comfortable doing that. So I'll show you the pivot. I'll show you the step. So yeah, I much prefer this step on that. Like anything, it feels awkward at first. You need to practice, practice, practice. I would recommend that you practice pivoting to your left with the hook. You can do this in the mirror, in shadow boxing. You can do it on the heavy bags, on mitt work, in sparring. But first, try and practice it in the shadow boxing position to get comfortable doing it, to get used to doing it, and then add it into the other aspects of your training. So I've just broke down the pivoting to your left with the hook, the pivoting to your right with the combination there. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe to this YouTube channel where I upload lots of boxing education videos. Also, what videos do you want me to create? Is there any boxing moves that you want? Leave them in the comments below and I will break them down. Thank you for watching.